The storm showed no mercy that night. Rain slammed against the tin roof like 1,000 tiny hammers, and thunder rolled over the open plains. Inside a lonely wooden cabin, a man sat by the flickering fire, clutching a baby wrapped in a faded quilt. His name was Daniel, a rancher whose calloused hands once fixed fences and fed cattle, now trembling as he tried to quiet a newborn who cried out in hunger and confusion. She didn't understand why her mother wasn't there to hold her. She didn't understand that her mother would never come back. 2 days ago, Daniel had buried the woman he loved beneath the oak tree behind the house, the same tree where they once carved their initials when they were young and hopeful. Now that tree stood as a cruel reminder of everything he'd lost. The house still smelled faintly of her lavender soap. Her boots still sat by the door, her coffee mug still on the counter. But she was gone. Daniel hadn't eaten in a day. Sleep had become a stranger. Every breath felt heavier than the last. He rocked the baby gently, whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep. The storm grew louder, wind howling through the cracks in the walls, lightning flashing across the window panes like jagged knives of light. The baby's cries echoed in the silence that followed. Daniel's voice broke as he whispered, "I don't know what to do anymore, sweetheart. I just don't know." He stared at the ceiling, eyes wet, praying for something, anything, to give him a reason to keep going. And then, just as he began to close his eyes in defeat, there came a sound he didn't expect. A knock. At first, soft. Then again, 3 deliberate knocks against the wooden door. He froze. No one came out this far, especially not on a night like this. The cattle station was miles away, the road nearly impassable in the storm. Who could it be? His heart raced, torn between fear and desperate hope. He gently placed the baby in her cradle, the creak of the floorboards nearly drowned out by the wind. Lightning flashed again, and for a split second he thought he saw a shadow move past the window. He reached for the shotgun leaning against the wall, then stopped. Whoever was out there hadn't come to harm him. He could feel it. There was something different in that knock, a rhythm that didn't sound threatening. It sounded human. He swallowed hard and took a slow step toward the door, and before he opened it, he whispered under his breath, "God, if this is a dream, don't let me wake up." He turned the knob, and what he saw changed everything. But before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Before the storm, before the quiet nights and the hollow echo of an empty home, there was Elias Carter, 42 years old, a rancher born and raised in the wide, wind-swept plains of Montana, the kind of man whose hands told stories, scarred, strong, and honest. He lived by simple rules: work hard, love fiercely, and never take more than you need from the land. His ranch sat miles from the nearest town, surrounded by golden fields that stretched toward the horizon, where sunsets painted the sky in colors words could never capture. Inside that small wooden home, there once lived laughter, soft, familiar, and full of life. On the mantel above the fireplace stood a framed photograph: Elias, his wife Grace, and a life they'd built together through years of sweat and sacrifice. He used to wake before dawn just to brew her coffee the way she liked it, black with 1 spoon of sugar. Grace would tease him, saying his coffee could wake the dead, and he'd laugh, promising to tone it down next time. But he never did. That was their rhythm, their peace, their love. The ranch had once been alive with sound, the lowing of cattle, the creak of barn doors, the faint hum of Grace humming to herself while she painted the baby's nursery. She'd always wanted a daughter. She'd chosen the name before the pregnancy even began. Lila, she'd said, because it sounds like hope. Elias had smiled, pretending not to cry, as he felt the baby's first kick under his calloused hand. They'd dreamed of watching her grow, teaching her the value of hard work and the beauty of small things, the smell of rain on dry soil, the way the mountains turned purple in the evening light, the miracle of seeing life bloom from the ground. But that miracle came with a cost no one saw coming. Grace went into labor early, too early. The hospital was hours away, the roads rough and unforgiving. Elias had begged for help on the radio, but the storm had already begun to rise. When it was over, only one heartbeat remained. He held his daughter for the first time with trembling hands, the weight of love and grief crushing him all at once. Grace never got to hold her child, never got to whisper her name. And in that moment, Elias's world, once filled with color and purpose, faded into shades of gray. He'd thought the hardest part would be losing her, but he was wrong. The hardest part was still to come, because every sunrise since that day felt like a reminder that she was gone, and he was still here, alone, with a baby who carried her mother's eyes, crying for a warmth he could no longer give. Tell me, if you were in his shoes, how do you think you'd go on? Could you? The days that followed blurred together like the gray sky above his ranch. Elias barely noticed time anymore, only the rhythm of his daughter's cries, the weight of silence between them, and the relentless pounding of the rain against the roof. He did what he could, the way any father would if left alone in the wilderness of grief. He warmed bottles, rocked her to sleep, whispered stories about the mother she'd never meet. But then one morning, the last bottle of milk ran dry. He stared at the empty tin in disbelief, his hands trembling as he shook it, hoping there might be one last drop. Nothing. The nearest town was miles away, and the roads, now rivers of mud, had swallowed any chance of escape. The phone lines were dead, the radio silent. He stepped outside for just a moment, the cold wind biting through his coat, rain soaking into his boots. The horizon was gone, swallowed by the storm. There was no one coming. He stood there, staring into the endless downpour, and whispered, "Lord, I don't know what to do." When he went back inside, the baby was crying again, soft at first, then louder, more desperate. It was a cry that didn't stop. He tried to rock her, sing to her, anything to calm her down, but nothing worked. She was hungry, she was scared, and so was he. Elias sank into the chair by the fire, clutching her close to his chest, feeling her tiny heartbeat against his. He had built his life on strength, on endurance, on the idea that if you worked hard enough, you could survive anything. But grief can break even the strongest hands. He looked at the portrait of Grace on the mantel, her gentle smile frozen in time, and the ache in his chest grew unbearable. "I can't do this without you," he whispered. "I don't know how." His voice cracked, and for the first time since the funeral, tears fell freely down his face. He pressed his lips to the baby's forehead and prayed, not for himself, but for her, that somehow someone would hear them, that somehow the world wouldn't forget them out here. Hours passed. The fire burned low. The baby's cries grew weaker. The wind howled outside, shaking the window panes as if the world itself was mourning with him. Elias's body ached from exhaustion, his eyes heavy, his spirit hollow. Then, just as he began to think he couldn't bear another second, he heard it. Faint at first, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. 3 slow, deliberate knocks at the door. His head lifted, his breath caught. Could it be real? He held his daughter tighter, his heart pounding in his chest, and that's when he heard it again. A sound that would change everything. Knocking. The woman at the door. For a long moment, Elias just stood there, frozen. The sound of knocking still echoed through the cabin, cutting through the storm like a heartbeat. He hesitated, unsure if grief was playing tricks on him again. But then came a voice, soft, trembling, and very real. "Hello? Is anyone home?" He rose to his feet, his legs unsteady. The baby whimpered in his arms as he crossed the floor and unlatched the door. The wind pushed it open, spraying cold rain into the room. And there, standing on his porch, was a woman. She looked to be in her mid-30s, soaked from head to toe, her coat clinging to her frame. In one hand, she held a lantern, its dim light flickering against the storm. In the other, she carried a small bottle of milk. For a moment, Elias couldn't find his voice. She looked like she'd come from another world, one untouched by his pain, yet carrying something gentle in her eyes. The woman took a cautious step forward. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I didn't mean to startle you. I heard a baby crying from the road. I thought maybe someone needed help." Elias blinked, trying to make sense of her words. "The road?" he asked hoarsely. "There's no road out there tonight, just mud and water." She nodded faintly, her hair plastered to her face. "I know. I got lost driving back from the next town over. My car stalled out about a mile back. I was going to wait it out, but then I heard her." She glanced at the child in his arms and smiled softly. "I don't know why, but something told me to follow the sound." Elias looked at the bottle in her hand, his throat tightening. "You brought milk?" She nodded again, a little sheepish now. "Yeah, I was carrying it for my sister. Her baby's about the same age. I figured, well, I don't really know what I figured. I just felt like I should bring it." Elias stared at her in silence, the weight of it all sinking in. The baby began to fuss again, but the moment Clara, he didn't know her name yet, stepped inside, the cries faded into quiet whimpers. The room seemed to change with her presence. The air felt lighter, warmer, as if the storm outside didn't dare intrude. Elias lowered his gaze to his daughter, who was now staring up at the stranger with wide, curious eyes. For the first time in days, she stopped crying. The crackle of the fire filled the silence between them. "You should sit," Elias murmured finally. "You're soaked through." The woman hesitated, then stepped closer to the fire, holding out the milk. "Here," she said gently. "Let's get her fed first." As she knelt beside him, their hands brushed, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or fate. She unscrewed the bottle cap, testing the warmth near the fire before handing it over. Elias fed his daughter, watching her tiny mouth latch onto the bottle, drinking hungrily. Relief flooded his chest so powerfully he almost forgot to breathe. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't even know your name." The woman smiled faintly. "It's Clara," she said. "Clara Hayes." He nodded, repeating it under his breath, as if the name itself carried comfort. "Elias," he offered. "Elias Carter." They sat there in silence for a while, listening to the rain. Then Clara spoke again, her voice calm, almost distant. "It's strange," she said softly. "I wasn't supposed to take that road tonight. My sister called, needed help with her little one. I packed up a few things for her, including that milk. But when I passed the old windmill, something in me just turned, like I needed to come this way instead." Elias frowned slightly. "There's no windmill near here." Clara looked at him, her expression unreadable. "There was one once," she said quietly. "A long time ago." He didn't answer, but a chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the cold. He glanced down at his daughter, now sleeping peacefully in his arms, and for the first time since Grace's death he felt something like. That night stretched long, but for the first time since the funeral, it didn't feel endless. The storm outside still raged, but inside that small cabin there was a different kind of quiet, one that didn't come from loneliness, but from peace. Clara moved gently through the room, her step soft against the wooden floorboards, as if she'd walked there before. She helped Elias feed the baby, her hands steady, her voice calm. When the little girl finished drinking, Clara wrapped her carefully in a blanket, humming a tune so soft and familiar that Elias found himself listening like a man starved for comfort. Then, without being asked, she began tidying the kitchen. She washed the dishes that had piled up by the sink, set a kettle over the fire, and found flour and dried beans in a tin beside the stove. Within minutes, the cabin smelled faintly of something warm, a scent Elias hadn't realized he'd missed until that moment. When she placed a simple meal before him, Elias shook his head. "You didn't have to do that." Clara smiled faintly, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "I wanted to. It helps to keep busy." He tried to offer her what little money he had, a few crumpled bills from the drawer, but she pushed his hand away gently. "No," she said. "Some debts are repaid in silence." Her words lingered in the air, soft yet weighted with meaning. He didn't understand, but he didn't press. Instead, he nodded, grateful beyond words. After they ate, the two sat by the fire, the baby cradled between them. The flames danced, casting long shadows on the walls, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Elias found himself speaking, really speaking, for the first time since Grace's passing. He told Clara about his wife, how she laughed with her whole heart, how she could calm the horses with just a whisper, how she dreamed of a future that never came. Clara listened quietly, her eyes glistening in the firelight. When he finished, she didn't speak right away. Then, in a voice low and trembling, she said, "I lost a baby once, too." Elias looked at her, his breath catching. Clara's eyes were distant, her mind clearly somewhere far away. "It was years ago," she continued. "My husband and I tried for so long. When I finally got pregnant, I thought it was a miracle. But something went wrong. The doctors couldn't save her. I never even got to hold her." She paused, her voice breaking. "After that, I couldn't stay in that house anymore. Everywhere I looked, I saw what could have been." Elias's chest tightened. For the first time, he understood the depth behind her quiet strength. Two broken hearts had somehow found their way to the same place on the same night. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. In that cabin, grief met grace. Clara reached out, touching the baby's tiny hand, and smiled through her tears. "She's strong," she said softly. "She's got your eyes." Elias tried to smile, but it faltered into something raw and honest. "She's got her mother's spirit," he whispered. And for the first time in days, he heard laughter again, small, fragile, but real. Clara laughed with him, and in that moment, the storm outside no longer mattered. It was as if Grace herself had sent someone to remind them that kindness still existed, even in the darkest corners of loss. But as the firelight flickered and shadows shifted across the walls, a quiet thought stirred in Elias's mind. Who exactly was Clara, and why? Why did she look so familiar? The storm had quieted by morning, though the sky still hung heavy with clouds. The smell of wet earth drifted through the open window, and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Elias sat by the cradle, gently rocking it with his foot, while Clara tidied up what was left of their small breakfast. It was a calm he hadn't known in weeks, a fragile calm that felt almost too good to last. Clara moved slowly around the room, her eyes tracing over the simple things that made up Elias's world, the bookshelf, the tools by the door, the photo frames on the mantel. Then she stopped. Her hand hovered near one frame, fingers trembling as if she'd seen a ghost. Elias turned, noticing the change in her expression. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Clara didn't answer right away. Her gaze was locked on the wedding photograph, Elias and Grace standing in front of the old oak tree, sunlight spilling across their faces. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's Grace," she said. "Your wife." Elias nodded slowly, unsure where her voice was leading. "You knew her?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. She reached out, touching the edge of the frame. "We grew up together," she said. "Back in Helena. She was like a sister to me. We lost touch after she moved out here. Life got busy, and I always meant to visit. But I never did." Elias's breath caught. For a long moment neither spoke. The only sound was the wind brushing against the windows. Then Clara reached into her coat pocket, her hand shaking as she pulled something out, a small folded envelope, worn and slightly stained from travel. She held it out to him. "She wanted you to have this," she whispered. "She sent it to me a few weeks before the baby came. She asked me to bring it to you after Lila was born." Elias stared at the envelope, his heart pounding in his chest. His name was written across it in Grace's familiar handwriting, soft, looping letters he hadn't seen since before the hospital. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, slightly smudged, but her words were still clear. He read aloud, his voice breaking as he went. "My dearest Elias, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to say what I needed to in person. Please don't let grief take away the good parts of who you are. I know you'll blame yourself. You always do. But love, none of this is your fault. You've given me more joy than I ever thought one lifetime could hold. Promise me you'll keep going. Promise me you'll teach our daughter to smile, even when the world feels heavy. And remember this, there's someone out there who will help you when you need it most. Don't turn them away. Grace." The letter trembled in his hands as he finished. He pressed it to his chest, tears streaming down his face, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. Clara looked away, her own eyes wet, whispering, "I should have come sooner." Elias shook his head, his voice raw. "You came when it mattered." Silence filled the room again, but it wasn't the hollow silence of grief anymore. It was a silence of understanding, of two souls bound by the same love for a woman who was gone, but not forgotten. Elias folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, setting it beside the photograph. "Thank you," he whispered. Clara met his gaze, her expression full of quiet sorrow and something else. Peace. In that moment, they both felt it. Grace's presence, still there, still guiding them. The baby stirred in her cradle, cooing softly, and Clara smiled through her tears. "She's got her mother's heart," she said. Elias nodded, unable to speak. He looked toward the window, where a faint light was breaking through the clouds, and whispered, "Maybe that's her way of saying she's home." But deep down, neither of them knew that fate still had one more test for them both. Night fell again over the quiet plains, heavy and restless. The air was thick with the smell of rain and ash from the old fireplace. Elias had finally put Lila to sleep, her tiny breaths steady, her little fingers clutching the corner of her blanket. Clara sat near the window, staring out at the horizon. The storm was beginning to rise once more, distant thunder rolling across the hills, flashes of lightning painting the sky in white. Neither of them spoke for a long while. It was as if the world was holding its breath. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. A blinding flash lit up the room, followed by a crack so loud it shook the walls. Elias rushed to the window and froze. The barn was on fire. Flames clawed upward, wild and hungry, devouring the dry timber in seconds. "The cattle!" Elias shouted, already reaching for his boots. Clara stood too, her eyes wide. "You can't go out there alone." But he was already out the door, rain pelting his face, smoke stinging his eyes. The wind howled as he ran toward the barn, the orange glow reflecting in the puddles at his feet. Inside, the terrified cries of the animals filled the air. He grabbed a rope, kicking open the stalls, trying to guide them out one by one. The heat was unbearable. The fire snapped and hissed, and a beam crashed down inches from where he stood. His lungs burned, his strength fading fast. He stumbled, coughing, his vision blurring. Then suddenly, Clara was there. She'd wrapped her shawl around her mouth, moving through the smoke beside him. Together, they pushed through the chaos, opening gates, guiding frightened animals toward safety. Elias fell once, nearly overcome by the smoke, but Clara pulled him up with a strength that didn't seem possible. "Come on!" she shouted through the roar of the flames. "We're not done yet!" They made it out just as the roof began to cave. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, fighting to smother the fire, hissing as it met the flames. Elias collapsed to his knees in the mud, gasping for breath. Clara turned to run back toward the cabin, then froze. Through the open door she saw smoke curling out. The fire had spread. The baby. She didn't think. She just ran. Elias tried to shout, his voice hoarse, but she was already inside, disappearing into the haze. The air inside was thick, choking. Clara wrapped her arm over her face, following the faint sound of crying through the smoke. She found Lila in her cradle, coughing softly, eyes wide with fear. Clara scooped her up, covering her tiny mouth with her shawl, and stumbled back toward the door. Just as she reached it, part of the ceiling gave way behind her, sparks raining down. She burst into the night air, coughing, clutching the baby tight against her chest. Elias rushed forward, taking Lila from her trembling arms. The baby was alive, safe. He sank to the ground, holding her close, his body shaking from exhaustion and relief. Clara knelt beside him, her face streaked with soot and tears. The rain fell harder now, washing away the smoke, cooling the embers. For a long moment neither spoke. Only the sound of the storm filled the air, the same storm that had once brought despair, now carrying a strange kind of grace. Elias looked at Clara, his voice breaking as he said, "You saved us." She shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. "You just needed someone to remind you you're still alive." He stared at her, the truth of her words sinking deep into his chest. And in that moment, he understood. This woman hadn't just come to his door to help. She had come to save their lives. His voice trembled as he whispered, "Sometimes angels don't appear in white robes. Sometimes they come drenched in rain, holding milk." Clara smiled softly, her eyes glistening in the dim light. Elias bowed his head, tears falling freely. By morning, the storm had passed. The sky, once bruised and heavy, now stretched wide and soft across the horizon, painted in quiet shades of gold and rose. The air was still damp, carrying the scent of rain and smoke, but there was peace in it, a peace that felt almost sacred. The barn was gone, reduced to smoldering timbers and blackened earth, yet somehow the ranch felt alive again. Inside the cabin the fire crackled gently, casting a warm glow over the room. Lila slept soundly in her cradle, her little chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, her face calm for the first time in days. Elias sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. Across from him, Clara sat in silence, her eyes red from the long night but calm, steady, as though she had finally found what she'd been searching for all this time. Neither of them spoke for a while. Words weren't needed. Outside, the last drops of rain fell from the roof, each one catching the morning light like a spark of glass. Elias finally broke the silence. "The roads'll still be flooded," he said softly. "You can stay here until they clear." Clara looked up, hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you," she said simply. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both sorrow and healing. "No," he replied quietly. "Thank you." The two sat there in the stillness, listening to the distant hum of the waking plains, the birds returning, the wind softening, the world beginning again. The baby stirred in her sleep, letting out a small sigh, and both of them turned toward her, smiling without saying a word. There was no need for talk of miracles, no grand speeches or promises, just a shared understanding, born from loss and grace, that something far greater than either of them had brought them to that night. The light spilled through the cracked window, touching the photograph of Grace on the mantel. Her smile seemed brighter now, almost alive in the morning glow. Elias looked at it for a long time before whispering under his breath, "We're gonna be okay." Clara lowered her gaze, her hands folded around her cup. The warmth seeped into her palms like sunlight. They didn't talk about miracles, but both knew they'd just lived one. The same storm that took so much also brought something back. A stranger, drenched in rain, holding milk, mercy, and a message from the woman he thought he'd lost forever. Slow instrumental rises, gentle piano, and acoustic guitar. Sometimes life doesn't give us the answers we pray for. Sometimes it gives us people, at the exact moment we need them most. Elias Carter thought the storm had ended his story, but in truth, it had only just begun. Because sometimes, hope doesn't shout. It knocks. Brief pause, soft music swells, then fades into warmth. And maybe that's what grace really is. Not a miracle in the sky, but a quiet knock on the door when we're too tired to stand. Transition to outro cue, calm, comforting tone. If this story touched your heart, give it a like. It helps us share more stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, do you believe in fate? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Music fades to silence. End screen rolls in softly.